Hi everyone, a bit of a special video this week. There were over 1,200 comments to the video about where I argued that we were in a sim gaming dark age. One of those responses was from a developer from the very interesting game Gunner Heat PC. He told me that the video really resonated and that he has also been tracking the development of our Cold War server. A crosstalk between both projects was proposed. In this video, we will talk about the sim gaming landscape, game design, and dive into specifics of how the GHPC team is thinking about how they will incorporate multiplayer into their game. I think this discussion was a really fun one, and it's clear that these guys are really passionate about what they are doing. If you found my Dark Age video about sim gaming interesting, then I would encourage you to listen to this in full. A possibility of how we go from the dark to the light is with these indie games that are trying to look at things with fresh eyes and make the game that we want to play rather than make games that we are used to. If this is your first time here, this channel focuses on multiplayer sim gameplay, so if you're into that, please subscribe. Let's get into it. I'm joined today with the GHPC team, and this was not really part of the plan, but because of a video that I made, our paths crossed, so we thought it'd be interesting to discuss our two different worlds. We'll start off with introductions, so I'll go from left to right. So Action Scripter, I'll kind of hand the mic over to you, and if you can give a quick intro for you and a little bit of the project, and I'll go to the line.
Yeah, for sure. I'm Josh Basuito, Action Scripter. I am the team lead for Gunner Heat PC, which is a sim light tank game.
And then Harry?
Oh, hey, I'm Harry. I was with Gunner Heat PC for the first year or so, developing their art pipeline and how it all looks and stuff, especially for the vehicles. I took a break doing another job and now sort of heading back into Gunner Heat PC this year.
Kavi?
Hey, I'm Blake Ferrugia. I go by Kavi. I do a lot of programming in general, but for Gunner Heat PC, I'm generally trying to fix up Action's messes.
I would dispute this.
And then Lancer?
I'm Kevin Baird. Go by Lancer. I work on the terrains and missions for Gunner Heat PC.
All right, perfect. So very nice to meet you all. So yeah, we kind of, like I said, not part of the plan. I would almost call it impromptu, but I was kind of happy to see it. So Action Scripture, you saw the video that I made about where I was kind of asking the question or maybe arguing my point that we might be in a sim dark age, and it seemed like it resonated, and you reached out afterwards. So I would be kind of curious if you could just kind of set the table of what your reaction was and kind of give the context with the for the reason of your project as well, because I would assume they're kind of aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say resonated is definitely the right word. Your video captured a lot of thoughts that I'd had myself about the way sim gaming is going these days. I started in sim games in late 90s, early 2000s. I was pretty young at the time, but there were a lot of great games back then that kind of captured that blend of realism and accessibility. And a lot of them were very grounded. They had a setting that made sense. They had a very kind of pared down and purposeful selection of vehicles. There were no microtransactions yet to my memory. It was all kind of, hey, we want to make something cool, straight to the point. And a lot of those games were bangers. They were very enjoyable. So I tried a lot of stuff more recently, and I didn't get that flavor. Stuff like War Thunder, the various other games, didn't really capture the feeling that I remembered. And when you put that video out and I watched it, you hit the nail on the head, in my opinion.
I'll kind of open this up to everyone, but I'm just kind of curious to get a feel for the room. Maybe this is kind of like I'm almost imagining like an Alcoholics Anonymous session, but it's like almost like, when was the last time you had your last drink? But I mean, like, did we all get thrown into the snails work camp at some point, and then we now shun it, or?
I've spent more hundreds of dollars on War Thunder than I would like to admit.
How about you, Harry?
I played it way back when it was just planes. Pretty much as soon as the ground stuff came out, I had some friends that started playing that, and I don't know, it didn't hit right. I don't know if maybe it was just because there were so few vehicles. I don't know. The plane stuff was fun because you could just jump in. It was like Counter-Strike in the sky, but the ground stuff never got me, so I managed to quit before any of that happened, I suppose.
Copy?
Action introduced it to me way later in its development. I think he had a very high battle rating, and he wanted me to kind of get a feel for the game, see if it was my cup of tea. It was not, and thank you, Action, for the premium that you got me at the time. I'm sorry that we did not see eye to eye on that game.
No worries. The least played XM1 of all time.
How about you, Lancer? Did you ever get involved with War Thunder? And kind of what was your, if you did, kind of what were your thoughts like playing it and kind of and exiting it?
I still play it. It's like planes at least. It's pretty fun still. Like I think the most enjoyment I have, which isn't like the classic experience, is the squadron like AV8. It's like a limited time window they have, where like you get a certain amount of planes or tanks or whatever, and you go fight another, like basically like old school clan matches.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So for me, like I played it in beta, and it was interesting because I played. It almost seemed like War Thunder and World of Tanks came out around during the same time. They were both like in beta. So I did World of Tanks initially, and then War Thunder came out. And as soon as it was out of beta, I was kind of grinded out. I was kind of tired of it. But it seems like at least on an annual basis, I come back to War Thunder and try it out. And for me, it's like really just to reconnect with old friends and kind of talk while we're kind of just playing in the background. But I think your guys' story is interesting because going through old interviews and seeing how you guys were thinking about it and kind of the reason to entry is a love letter to tanks and mounted combat. And, while War Thunder is trying to do something and satisfies a certain demand, there is a gap in the market. And I think you guys are trying to build into that or to capture that. So, Action Scripture, I would love to hear kind of the thoughts that you have about this love letter and the focus you're putting into not just the tanks but the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like what you said. There's a big gap in the market right now. So there are plenty of good tank games out there, depending on your taste. Like Steel Beast Pro, that's the preeminent tank simulator. It can't be beaten right now as far as authenticity and like the nitty gritty features, simulation features. But that's not always what you want to play. There's times when you just want to jump in. Just want to get some action, have that aesthetic, that veneer of realism, but not have to do all the very specific stuff and managing forces and everything that goes into Steel Beasts. And plus, there's the price point. I mean, there's a lot of things, reasons that it might not be somebody's cup of tea. So you got that on the one end of the spectrum. You've got World of Tanks on the other end, and then in the middle, there's that kind of barren zone. There's been a few titles here and there over the years that fall somewhere in between, but right now there's not really anything on the radar. And so that's where we said, well, let's just make it ourselves. Specifically, I went through a long run of trying to find a good tank game, something that vibed with that old school sim-light feel. I tried all of them. Tried Armored Warfare, tried World of Tanks, tried War Thunder. Nothing really hit right. So that's where we made our move. And we're just trying to capture that blend, that accessible controls, no grind, just focusing on the experience, the combat, and simulating only the systems that we think make a difference in that moment to moment.
I would imagine that I have had a little bit of experience with this because of and Action Scripture and I were talking about this a couple of days ago, but like I have a DCS server, and I can say from my experience that I saw a need in the DCS community, or I thought there was a need in the DCS community, and there was a gap in the market, right, for the Kolovar planes. And in DCS, everything was dominated by like the modern planes. So I was thinking to myself, like, this could be really neat. This could fill a big void, and I think it could be popular, but I'm not really sure. And it did become really popular. Like we're one of the largest servers now. So I would be kind of curious to hear your guys'. I know you guys are still building it, but you guys are public now. So I would be kind of curious to get the feel from the room or the reaction from the room of like how you guys are thinking of the reaction so far now that it's been public and you guys have started to build it and release parts of it.
It's been very positive. There was a lot of fear going into it because this is our first big project as a team. If you look up the Radiant simulations, you're not going to find anything, any past releases. So it's like there was all this potential, and we thought we had something good, but you can never tell. Are you in your own bubble? Insulated from the broader opinions, and how's it actually going to go? But it went very well. We sold enough units at this point to fund the early access development, the roadmap features that we have laid out. We've got the team together. We're hitting our goals. So it was definitely one of those risks that paid off. I'm pretty happy with it.
Yeah, when Action Scripter was first working on this, he was very jazzed about the idea, and I saw that passion. I thought that was very cool, but at the same time, I was not fully on board with, I guess, where tank games kind of were. When I had mentioned previously about trying to get into War Thunder with him, it didn't really bite me or sink its teeth into me, because I had played World of Tanks back in the day, and I'd seen the grind, and I just wasn't a fan of that kind of gameplay. I saw that Action was trying to do something different, and I thought that was cool, but a lot of the crowd that seemed to be attracted from that were more of the, simulator or the really minutia, detail-oriented sort of enthusiast of tanks, or for tanks, rather. And it just seemed to me like, okay, there's clearly an interest here, but I don't know if it's like enough to garner, like, oh, we could do a public release and we could get enough cash to keep going on development for it. I was clearly in the wrong about that. I'm very happy with where we are at right now.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I forgot the early days in some way, but you reminded me that the initial interest was almost all from salty War Thunder players and Steel Beast players looking for a new experience. So we had this kind of dichotomy. We had these competing demands about how the game was going to develop. People that wanted basically make War Thunder but better, and people that wanted make Steel Beast but better. And we have no problem with Steel Beast, but we're not trying to make Steel Beast. It's very good at what it does, and there's no reason to try to muscle in on that. And War Thunder, the entire reason that we're making it is because War Thunder and its feature set don't hit the point that we want to make. So it's kind of like this navigation of expectations and trying to tell people, well, that's not what we're going for. Just wait and see.
Yeah, I for what it's worth, I feel like I knew it was going to work from the start. Like, it's kind of similar reasons to the dark age of sim gaming thing, which is like genius clickbait way to summarize the idea. But it's kind of true, right? Like, there's a Sims in the old days kind of used to be, it'd be a whole package, and the context would make sense. And I think that's kind of, I don't know, from the outside looking in, I'm not like a DCS guy. I've played it a little bit, but it's definitely not my main. Like, it's basically for the reasons that when people are playing it a lot of the time, they don't seem super interested in the broader context and the sort of combat ecosystem. And I remember thinking, like, when people would ask me to get into DCS, I'd sort of say, well, where's the interlocking parts aren't really there. And I feel like the server that you've set up Enigma is quite, it's pretty much addressing that in a lot of ways. It's trying to create an actual context where the aircraft have a role to play and everything makes sense. And the funny thing about that, the initial reaction thing that we were talking about is when we first sort of started pitching the whole thing, and you may have come across a similar thing as well. I'm not sure, but when we sort of started trying to market the idea and get people interested, I mean, at the start it was just Josh, but we've all been there for a lot of the process. But people sort of can't. They can't. It's almost like they can't conceptualize a game that has that sort of like that complete. There's a system to it, like there's all the parts that are necessary to make the thing make sense are all there, because it's been non-stop for the past decade or two. It's been either free to play sort of junk games, or like really, really deep system stuff that, like DCS and all that kind of thing, that come with this weakness of there's a limited amount of stuff that the developers can actually push out, and you end up missing all these things. Whereas something like IL-246 or whatever, because they didn't have trillion try aircraft and all the systems simulated, they could crank them out, and they could actually fill out the combat scenario was really quite complete in a way. And it took a long time for people to sort of, we notice it gets easier as we go. People start sort of understanding more. They're like, oh, so this is what they're trying to do. Okay, I start to get it now. But initially we got a lot of critiques and a lot of complaints that it's like, oh, how are you going to balance this? It's like, well, we don't need a balance. Like, it doesn't matter that there's T-55s on one side and M60s with thermals on the other, because in reality, there's a zillion of the T-55s, right? So the balance comes from the actual scenario rather than vehicle versus vehicle, and that was a big barrier that we had to overcome. And the other one was, and this is a barrier we kind of still come up against, is it's where's all the interiors, where's the first person stuff, which maybe we'll talk about later. I've been going on for a while.
You make. Oh, sorry. Harry makes a really good point. That even happens internally, like during development in those first couple of first year or so. Once Action Scripter was bringing people on, like I was definitely coming from the perspective of, well, how's this going to balance? How are people going to spawn in? How is XYZ gamified feature going to happen? And then over time, as we've been building this up, it's been really thrilling to learn more about and implement some of the design systems that we've got.
I should probably be explicit about the context around this, by the way. The underpinning thing here is that in order to properly show tanks and armored vehicles in the fighting in the way that they were designed for, you have to put them in the situation they were designed for. And this is the piece that something like War Thunder doesn't give you. If a vehicle was designed in the late 70s, early 80s for the Cold War battlefield, it's going to have traits that only make sense in that battlefield. And if you put it up against some random vehicle at a battle rating, it's just going to be lost. You're not going to understand or appreciate that design. So instead of having this kind of homogenized random mishmash of tanks facing each other, we have this scenario that's very explicit in its time and place. Germany, 1985, specifically Central Germany, Centag. We have the Abrams, the early Abrams. We have the T-55, T-72, M60, yada yada. We've got Russians coming later, West Germans with the Leopards. That's not a set of vehicles that all have parity with each other. There's some real mismatched capabilities there. But in the context of their battle groups and the missions that they're carrying out, they make sense. They were meant for certain roles. We'll make them play that role. And only in that context can you actually get an appreciation for what they are.
Okay. A lot to unpack. And I really like it. So it's interesting because for me personally, I was just talking to someone about this yesterday. Anyone familiar with the game Natural Selection? You guys remember that game?
Oh yeah,
beautiful game, absolutely beautiful game.
Right, awesome game, right? And I'll go with what it's not. It's not Counter-Strike, right? Counter-Strike, which is a great game on its own, right? And it's balanced and there has a meta and all that, and it's been around. Everyone has played Counter-Strike, right? It's guns versus guns. But Natural Selection, for people listening who are not familiar with it, it's interesting because it's basically like Space Marines who have guns versus aliens who don't necessarily have guns, right? Because they're more like biters and such. And that asymmetrical setup is very interesting. And when I think about the games that I like really asymmetrical games. I really like World War II flight sims. I think World War II flight sims are the most interesting flight sims because from the beginning to the war to the middle and the late, you have like all of these airplanes that are so reflective of the design philosophies. And going into the Cold War, you have that as well. And I'm really glad that you guys picked a Cold War setting because it's kind of what you said. It's like balancing the environment, not the units. And we try to do the same way, and it's very subtle because I will go into our server and start tweaking things that players that may not notice, like the actual unit count or the type of units that are just AI, and just certain percentages off a few things, like you can balance an environment. So I'm definitely vibing with what you guys are saying. My question to you guys is, and this came up earlier when you were talking Action Scripter about, you guys messaged out that you guys are doing something, and people didn't know how to react, right? They didn't know how to understand it because they just have been kind of in a, I don't want to say a trance, but they've just been living in this environment for a really long time. And in some ways, this might be a little dramatic, but in some ways you guys are kind of like crusaders in a way, right? You're trying to change something and do something different. And you have people from War Thunder coming over, you have people from Steel Beast coming over, and there's competing interests, right? It's two different interest groups that like tanks. And I would be really curious on like your design philosophies and like, did you guys like map those out and say like, these are the hard lines we're not going to cross, or things that you reference back, almost like an internal constitution, if you will. I'm kind of curious on how you guys think about that.
Yeah, you bring up some interesting stuff there. The thing that you mentioned about people's preconceptions, internally we call that War Thunder brain, and it's pretty pervasive. It's definitely something that we see over and over again in the questions we get, like, hey, are you going to add the Merkava? Like, okay, well, maybe if the Merkava was in Semtag in 1985, we would consider it, but stuff like that. It's just everything comes from that kind of direction. So we do have our internal kind of guiding philosophy. It's massaged over time as we develop the game, see how people are responding, see how we like it. But ultimately, what we set out to do was make a tank game that we would want to play. So we have these ideas, make an old school sim light, make it based in a realistic time and place, do this, do that. And we pretty much stick to those core ideas. There's not that many of them. The details are sorted out as we go, as we see what works and what doesn't. But we are fundamentally not at the whims of what people ask for. Like, if we were trying to make a mass appeal game, we would just make War Thunder, right? There's proven success out there to be had. And we're purposely going a different direction because we think we can make something good, and we think enough people will respond to it. As far as the actual, internal constitution, as you said, it's not extremely complicated. It's just blend realism and accessibility, make it based in reality, convey why the things are there and what they're doing. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think if there's any kind of guiding principle, other than there's a few basics, like we don't want to turn this into like we don't want to create a situation where we're obliged to make decisions that would compromise on the things that we really know we want to do, which is basically we want to do some faith to these, like do some justice to the depiction of the things that we're trying to depict. But on that note, on a high level, we don't want to get into a situation where, for example, we're dependent on a publisher that wants us to increase our, that might increase our overheads and ask us for more cash, and then we have to start thinking, oh, are we going to do like are we going to split a zillion DLCs out? Are we going to make it so you can buy tanks or whatever? And getting suggestions like that and demands like that, we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable to that kind of thing. But other than that, I guess sometimes we'll be implementing something, and it might feel a bit funny, like we're looking at it and thinking, is this how it really should be? And then we'll sort of have an informal conversation, like according to like what we're trying to do. is this the right design decision to make? Is this in alignment with our goals? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it's not like we don't have like an official like design pillars document. But the team's small enough. Like there's only 4 core members. The team's small enough that we all know those sort of principles pretty well. Maybe if we had a lot more core members, we'd need to codify it a bit.
Yeah, we're at that kind of comfortable size where we can just basically go off of vibes. We know where we are and where we're going, and if we disagree on it, we can figure out why and fix it. And that stuff that Harry mentioned about not wanting to be beholden to a publisher or some kind of external force, that's also very important. I forgot to mention that, like the artistic integrity of what we're making, not to sound like all ooh, but it is a concern because, I mean, we're gamers, right? We've played games for a while. We've seen what happens when the vision of a franchise is compromised by the need to increase profit. We don't want that for our project. A lot of times we make difficult decisions about what do we want to cater to versus what do we want to hold true to in our vision. It's not that common, but sometimes stuff comes up and we say, okay, we're going to make it the way we want. Not everybody will enjoy it that way. That's probably okay. We're going to make the game that we intend.
Sometimes that's half the fun. Like disrupting, like people get used to something and then we're like, well, sorry, we're going to change that because what we're actually trying to do, that's not in line with what we're trying to do. And, you know, it might make some people mad. I think there's been guys who actually refunded the game because of choices we made, but it's like, it's again, one of those things where maybe if we were beholden to some other economic management of some sort, like maybe we wouldn't be able to do stuff like that, or we'd have to get approval or something. But the situation we're in, it's like, we're making the thing the way we think is right, and if people don't like it, like, you know, that's like there's other games for them out there. We don't need to worry about it that much because our overheads aren't enormous, you know.
Yeah, a concrete example. Sorry to cut you off.
Go for it.
A concrete example would be the way the aiming works. You've got in War Thunder, you have FPS aiming. You just move the mouse and it pulls the turret along with it. I can't remember if World of Tanks has that as well, or it has like direct aim, but I know Armored Warfare has a more direct aiming. It's like very quick most of the time. We looked at that and we said, you know what? This is not going to work with fire control systems. Anything that has dynamic lead, you have to keep a consistent rate of traverse. That's more important than where you're actually aiming half the time. So we did this kind of progressive mouse aim system where the farther you move the mouse from where you clicked, the faster you turn. And it takes some getting used to. If you just pick up the game for the first time, it's like, what is this? It's all floaty and stuff. But as soon as you retune your brain to handle it, all of a sudden you mesh with the tank and you can direct that fire control system exactly where you need it. And then the strengths of certain vehicles, like the Abrams, they come through because that fire control system will do all the thinking for you as far as how to actually aim the shot, and you'll hit moving targets at 2 kilometers every time. You can't do that with free aim, like Kentucky Windage. Sure, people would get good at it and they would guess, but that's not the special thing about that tank, so that's not going to work. Stuff like that.
I will say I always feel great when my guesses are correct, though. But what I was going to say was we haven't let or haven't needed to have numbers drive the conversation about our design in anything. People have given us feedback, things they like, they don't like. Like Harry said, sometimes that resorts to refunds, or when Patreon was our main source of income, people just dropping off. But we never sat there and, it said, oh no, wait, we'll change this, please stay. We've always been very consistent on this is the kind of stuff you need to get used to, and give it a second, you'll find it fun. but some people who are very War Thunder brained, as we've coined the term, are not into that, it seems.
Yeah, and that's fine. There's always going to be a part of the audience that's this just isn't their thing. Kind of like War Thunder wasn't our thing, but
yep.
Yeah, it is what it is.
It's interesting because I'm going to make a gross overgeneralization, but how do I want to think about this? What my reaction is that you guys are producing something, and I know Action Scripter, you said like I think you were trying to say you're not thinking of it as artists, but I actually do think you guys are artists in a way, because you are creating some form of entertainment for people. And it's interesting to compare it to more old school art forms where people were making something and then putting it out there, and the artist was staying true to their design philosophies, if you will, or their philosophies in producing something, and the feedback loop was very slow, right? Because of older mediums that had to go out into the market and get produced and hit different points of sales, and then they would sell, and then they would get the feedback loop. For you guys are producing something with a design philosophy and putting your foot down, if you will, or deciding on something and saying, we're not going to do that, and then get the immediate feedback from players who are essentially unsubscribing or refunding, right? And then you guys are staying true to it. So I would almost argue, again, this is my gross overgeneralization, but just my knee-jerk reaction, but I would say that you almost have to have stronger conviction to say, like, we're really not going to do that, because I would imagine it's harder to do it now with the immediate data coming back versus with more traditional mediums where you don't hear about it until later. You know what I mean?
That's I've had conversations similar to that with other game developers. A lot of them work in like AAA, stuff like that. The bigger you go in game development, the more insulated you tend to be from the feedback. Our team is very small and our project's small, relatively, so we are not insulated in any way unless we like actively choose not to look for feedback. And even then, some of it will make its way in. So yeah, it is tough at times. It's something I didn't anticipate going in. The need to really steel yourself against the feedback and kind of make a distinction between like opinions that you can say, okay, well, that's not their cup of tea, versus stuff that actually matters. And some people are rude and some people are nasty, and that's just, comes with the territory. But I would say on the whole, we've gotten used to it now. Certainly a surprise, though, overall.
So
it's definitely harsher or harder to do initially, because I've had conversations with Action very early on in development where some of the people would be asking for either off the wall things or giving feedback that was not very helpful or was just plain rude. And that's like something that has to affect you. It's a very visceral feeling to have to like determine to not knee jerk off of that and just say like, I wish I could just tell off this particular person on this thing. It's like, no, that's stupid, and I don't even want to pay any attention to it.
It's a very ingrained kind of brain psychology thing, right? Like you feel attacked when certain kinds of comments come at you, and then you have to like force yourself, okay, I'm not in combat right now. There's no danger. I can just close the tab. I can just pretend this doesn't exist and move on with my day, right? But you want to fight it out.
Yeah, it's a thing you care about too, your idea, and then it's also kind of tied to some like weird monetary thing on the tail end too, which you have to try and separate yourself from. It's nutty. It gets wild.
Yeah, I can relate. So Action Scripter asked me, yeah, you did ask me, or maybe it was Harry, I forget who asked me, but to kind of compare and contrast the server with the project. So I mentioned that because I'm not plugging the server just to plug it, but I can say that the War Thunder brain, our what we have in our world, or my world, is we call it MFD brain rot. So basically, in DCS, a lot of the servers, like the most popular module is F-18, right? Which is the one that they made in the games, like a 2000 eras one, which is just riddled with MFDs. Like the inside of that plane looks like an Apple store, and and basically it was like almost like predetermined or pre-thought that like any server that didn't have that module was committing suicide, right? It wouldn't do it. And the hill that I wanted to die on was that like that's module. I told people, I was like, I'd rather close the server than have that module in the server. I was like, we were determined to do something different. So I understand where you guys are coming from and trying to think outside the box and do something different, and not just. It's not about refusing feedback. The way that I think about it is that like, I'm trying to think of a nice way to put it, but like, it's almost trying to shepherd people along, right? Because if the idea is really solid, it's okay that people might not understand it initially, but if they give it a try and they like it, but they're not fully on board, as they learn it more and understand it and start to appreciate it, it's almost like a refined taste, right? And like this rejection of like the modern day modules in DCS, I think is like really becoming more on the forefront, and it's like people are developing a taste for it and understanding it better. And I even see it like on the stats, like we have like this really in-depth like database where we track player performance, and like the whole community is getting better because like, they're learning more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's really cool. It must be heartening to see that that adaptation increase and people just starting to click with it.
It's been interesting because I mean, you make a sandbox and then like the people go play in it, right? And then they start off making mounds, and now like they're making like medieval sandcastles. So it's like then you have to make the scenario more complex. So it's been interesting.
That's a good thing, right? Like, but when you were saying that, I was even thinking like it doesn't even necessarily have to be framed as like their taste is improving or whatever. Like there's more like there's people who might know everything there is to know about some, the subject matter, for example. But the reality at the end of the day is most people don't have any kind of vocabulary or training to think about. Like it's not part of their something that they dedicate energy to think about that kind of thing and actually conceptualize it and sort of war game it out in their head, like how would this scenario work. And the other thing is that like I was saying before, like it's been decades of certain types of games, and I guess you've got a mini version of that in DCS, right? You're getting module after module that are kind of capabilities pilled in a way, like they're like the assumption is if you're going to put something out, it's got to be the best version of that plane. Like I talk about this all the time. I'm not even a DCS player, but it's just like, why isn't there an F-16A? It's like it's probably the most common one, right? But they have to have the MFD'd up one that can shoot everything. And the weird thing to me about that is like it doesn't take a heap of imagination to sort of say, okay, we've got all this like clicky cockpit and all these interactables and stuff. Why wouldn't we do the one that has more character and more and like you jump in something with an MFD, you've got the same controls almost in every situation, right? But like the whole point of the clicky cockpit and being able to actually familiarize yourself with the workflow and the ergonomics and everything, it's about that character sort of being carried through, right? Again, not a DCS player, but to me that seems like the big selling point of being able to actually simulate the cockpit properly is it can have character, right? And that's the thing. Like in a sim, the sorry, there's vehicles outside my house. In a sim, the character is the machinery. You want your main characters to be to kick ass, and you want them to be differentiated, and the same rule applies for pretty much every game.
Yeah, you 100%. I mean, the thing you're saying for character, like in our community, we call it soul. Like, does the plane have soul or not?
Yeah.
And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about like the clash of design philosophies, right? Like, in the Cold War, especially early Cold War, like, I mean, the philosophies were so different, and it wasn't until the MFDs like just stamped out everything that things really changed.
Yeah.
What I would like to switch this to is just a pivot is into multiplayer, because I have I have some funny reactions and some anecdotal things I would like to share with you guys and kind of get your reactions. So I have been following your guys' project for a while. Tanks aren't really my most favorite thing, but they are very interesting. I usually like flying planes, but when you guys announced your project and I saw it, I was like, this looks neat, and I will follow this. And I know a lot of other people that are following your game very closely. Rossman, for example, I know, and I know he really is into your guys' game. And it's then you guys released your what you guys were going to do in early release and in the order, and I saw multiplayer was the final thing in there. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, because I have talked to some people, and in preparation for this, I have gone down the rabbit hole looking for any sort of public information of what you guys are planning for multiplayer. And it has been, as far as I can tell, it hasn't been talked about too much. And additionally, which I find really interesting, is I have spent a tremendous amount of time talking to people that are really following the game really closely. And I put them on the spot and I said, hey, if you had a free hand and you would design the multiplayer for this game, what would you do? And I was really surprised, because usually you ask gamers and they know exactly what they want, and I was getting a lot of different answers. And the most common answer was, I'm not sure. And I found that really interesting. So two-part question. Part one is, and actually, you and I have talked a little bit about this already off the mic, but why do multiplayer last? And part two is, what sort of design philosophies are you guys thinking about for multiplayer? And we'll kind of start there.
All right. So yeah, the first question is pretty easy. Multiplayer's last because that gives us the most time to get it right. Adding multiplayer to a game that isn't multiplayer from the ground up is a technical challenge, but also we have this kind of unknown thing that we've made, right? We've got this game that's different from a lot of the other ones that are out there, and adding multiplayer to that, it's kind of like when you ask people what they want to see and they said, I don't know. We have our own ideas, but we have to have time to prototype them, get them right before we kind of launch this new thing. So it's at the end of the roadmap just to make sure that we have the requisite time for it. And then that rolls into the second question, which I believe was the design philosophies. So the things that are set in stone right now, we want to focus on co-op, first of all, and we want to have the multiplayer be grounded in realistic situations, the same as the single player. And if we can pull it off, that would potentially even look like just drop in on single player stuff. We want it to be the same kind of experience, whether you're playing alone or with your friends or whatever. Not like a deathmatch arena fight, no battle ratings, none of the stuff that people have come to expect. We want to do something fresh. We want it to be very focused, mission-based, and get that same vibe that we're going for with the rest of the game. The thing that we get kind of for free, and I wanted to touch on this earlier and I forgot. By grounding the game in a realistic situation, you teach people why things are the way they are. Why were the tanks designed like this? And you get so, for example, when I played Armored Fist 3 back in the day, the crew were giving fire commands, gunner, sabo, tank, whatever, all that stuff. And I had never heard of this before. I was like, what are they saying? And so I looked it up, and then I learned how a crew operates in a tank, right? And then the more detail you throw in, the more grounded it is, the more people learn about the subject matter, and you can get people really into it and excited about it in a way that you won't get from Counter-Strike with tanks. Here's your tank. Your tank is like your skin. Go for it. And so that philosophy and that groundedness, we're bringing that into the multiplayer as well. Since I know it's going to come up, PvP is something that we have to look at a lot more closely, because once you give people an incentive to break the game to get the upper hand on each other, the game has to be a lot more protected against that stuff. Anti-cheat, deliberate design stuff. So we're still looking at it. We're not giving a solid yes or no on PvP at the moment.
I think the easiest way to explain why multiplayer is at the end of the list, and I know there'll be plenty of people who have some experience in game dev or know people who have experience in game dev, and they'll be like, that's a tall order, like, and it is to put multiplayer in at the end. It is kind of traditionally it's not the good way to do things, but it's I guess the funny thing is people always frame it as why is multiplayer at the end, but the reality is it's single players at the start. We want the single player experience to be good, specifically because I mean, full disclosure, I was with Offworld working on Squad a few years ago, and without a active community of people who want to play it online, the game is dead. And I think given that we are doing something that's a little bit new, we can't assume that it's going to take off and be active in multiplayer. And if you design around multiplayer, you open yourself up, you make yourself fragile to, if people decide that they're not super interested in it, or something to just like to get the actual game rolling and happening in the first place. I'm sure you would have come across some sort of problems with this, like getting people into the server in the first place, but I think you started in YouTube, right? That getting that ball rolling is a lot easier if people can get pretty much the full experience just playing it on their own. They get all the fire control, they can attack enemies and all this kind of thing. And the other thing is, I guess, I don't know, like Josh said, like PvP is an unknown quantity. It might happen, it might not. And I think there's a lot more fun to be had in this kind of game in co-op anyway, especially with things like multi-crew. Like if the single player game is good, we can pretty much put multi-crew in and it's going to kick ass. You know, that's not a problem that we have to solve anymore. Whereas if we started with multiplayer, we immediately presented with this giant cliff of how do we get people actually on the server and playing.
The
I-
game is not
Oh,
going
go
to look much different from co-op to single player. Like, it's mostly going to be like or at least the multiplayer portion. Like multi-crew is going to be like our main achievement, I guess. So that and like a few other tanks in like your platoon or something. It's not like it's going to be like 64 players. It's going to be like you and your friends. At least that's like how I personally see it. So
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
not going to look too much different when you're actually playing multiplayer than single player. Besides, like, I don't know, your wingman tank is significantly smarter because they're a human being.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Dumber.
I don't know about that. I might be your
or,
wingman.
or dumber.
I think that's a really important point. Like we want to go for probably smaller player counts, because firstly, you don't end up in the situation where the game is fragile to, if you design a game for like 100 players, and that's the context the game is meant to be played in. If there aren't 100 people in your region that want to play and a server to support it, you can't play the game. Functionally, it doesn't work, right? Like we don't want to be fragile to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think you guys really nailed it. And one of the things I like that we put on the roadmap last with multiplayer is like just looking at that roadmap, it grows and grows with functionality and support, and then multiplayer is kind of like all that stuff, with your friends. And it to me, multiplayer is like the last best complement of all the features that we're aiming for that we can put into the game. I really want those solidified first.
Yep. It's a conventional wisdom that even a mediocre game becomes fun if you're playing it with your buddies. If we make a good game, a good single player game, how much more fun will it be with your friends,
Or to your detriment, because then I am your gunner.
Yeah, that is true.
It's interesting. What are my reactions? Okay, so my first reaction is, you guys ever see that game Wolfpack? That submarine game?
Yep.
I think I've played it.
Yeah, so that game was actually kind of interesting, and What they did was kind of the opposite from what you guys did, which was they were multiplayer, I think, day one, and multi-crew day one, and the game's a little hard to play. It's interesting because I think they're probably maybe the first game ever to try to do a full fidelity submarine simulator, and it's impressive. But it's kind of what you guys are saying. It's like if it's not populated, if you can't get the crew, and like it's a little tricky. And the other thing, which I've never actually thought about, what you said, ActionScriptor, which is about anti-cheat, I've actually never thought about that because from like the server, I benefit from an actual company, DCS or ED, excuse me, that handles most of the anti-cheat stuff. So I just kind of ride in that wake, so I don't even need to worry about that. But then if you guys open Pandora's box, then it's like I don't want to say permanent, but that's a constant threat that can pop up at any point, right? And then if something is breaking the servers or breaking the balance or cheating or whatever, like you guys have to stop what you're doing and fix it. So that's kind of I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, I think
Especially in a movie, right? Like it's a well-known engine. People know how to hack it.
You should still have like at least the baseline of what we're thinking of in terms of introducing multiplayer, like a competitive thing where like people have to be cheesing the fucking like the game. Like you've got, I assume, server rules about some doing one thing or another.
Oh yeah, I mean that happens, and we have to stamp it out, and it's a constant thing.
Yeah, it'd be like that, but like unsupervised, like multiplayer games, or you're competing against people. Like, oh, I found you can hide behind this tree and they can't see out, so I'm just sniping everybody. Like, oh fuck, never meant to play like that.
So there's two games that I can point to give very concrete examples of like why this philosophy works. One would be Payday 2, which is the game that me and Kavi played the absolute shit out of before we got ashamed of.
So much.
To the point where our significant others grew a dislike for the game because of how much time we would spend on the daily playing it. That game has co-op, no competitive multiplayer, and it has cheaters. And the cheaters, they're never doing things like, getting kill streaks on you or something. They're like moving the money bags instantly to the van or whatever, using weapons they haven't unlocked. It's a very different level of consequence than a competitive game. And when you get a cheater in Payday, it's like, oh, that's kind of funny, whatever. I guess we all benefit from free cash this round. Okay, next one. You're not going to leave that experience mad that somebody ruined your game and then growing a dislike for the game and the community as a response. And then the other example is Escape from Tarkov. That is a Unity game. That is a competitive game. And when cheaters are in that game, it's very bad. You lose progress. You get tilted. It's very not fun. And so just doing the cooperative focus, we're probably going to be more in line with the Payday experience where someone does cheat. Who cares? If your friend's going to spawn into the game and have some kind of mod that makes their Abrams fire at the Bradley's cyclic rate, okay, cool. Make a screen recording, laugh about it. It's not going to ruin anybody's game.
One thing, I'm going to go off the rails a little bit. So, did you guys ever play World War II Online? Any of you guys ever play that?
I've heard about that.
I tried.
God,
it wasn't
yeah.
popular enough to have fun.
I played it with Blue Drake
I think I only heard about it through Harry.
like 10 years ago.
Yeah, so I played that game forever ago. In my life as a gamer, I would probably say that World War II Online is probably the best game I've ever played before. And for those that didn't play it, World War II Online modeled a piece of Europe. Like it went from West Germany, it had part of Belgium, part of Netherlands, part of France and England modeled on a half scale. So if you flew a HE-111, a German medium bomber from Germany, and flew it to England to do a bombing run and flew back, that would take 3 hours in real life time. And at one point, there were thousands of players playing, and you had playable tanks and infantry and trucks and destroyers and planes and everything. And that was probably the closest thing where it was like a full, real online battlefield. The only thing I can think that ever came close, and it was on a much smaller scale, was maybe Planet Side. But tanks in that game were really interesting, and the PvP in tanks was really interesting because they had like a really realistic damage model in that game, and because of the attacks on towns were very telegraphed, you would get into these tank duels where people would post up and you would engage with these early war tanks, like a kilometer or two out. Move to a position, turn your engines off, and listen for tanks to move. And it was really interesting. When I think about your guys' game and me having that experience and kind of thinking about what you guys have said, I do wonder for PvP. The way that I've thought about it is, what if the focus was really on the environment, which was like if the AI was really kind of the main thing, where the AI would kind of push each other's towns, and that would be the focus, and the player influence on that would tip the balance and kind of move it in different ways. And I would be kind of curious from you guys' reaction, not so much on the idea, if that's a good idea or not, but more of a reaction as you guys as game developers. I mean, like, from an engine standpoint, like, is that even feasible, or is that something completely out of the realm? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so this kind of touches on a lot of stuff that we're going for, but in a very different way, because we don't have an open world system. We have, I think the biggest terrain that we have for a mission is 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers. So you're not going to be traveling between countries on that kind of scale. And Lancer can elaborate on this a bit, maybe, but we have locations that we pull from the real world, but we don't explicitly label them as such. We keep it kind of generic. And the scenarios are how we get that sense of purpose. We make missions that are asymmetrical, that have a very specific stated goal and conditions for one side or the other coming out on top. And we set up that stuff like, hey, there's a town. Your scouts lost contact. Go figure it out and destroy any enemy elements you find there. Or, hey, there's an infantry assault taking place. You are the tank. You need to make sure they get there okay and take the town. Like, we can construct these scenarios because it's a single player game. We can just prearrange that stuff. The same kind of vibe that you're talking about from World War II Online, where you had these tank duels where people were in position waiting for the town attack and kind of anticipating that. We can just cut right to the chase with our kind of smaller time scales and our short, fast-paced missions. And that's something that we have to very deliberately design for, and just put it in mind, hey, we want people to have this kind of experience, or we want to convey this sort of role for this vehicle. It's an interesting kind of meeting point where it's the same idea but approached from a different direction.
I could probably give you a more technical answer to that. Anything's possible, but we only have so much time in our lives to do these things. But realistically, like, the engines that we have now, Unity, for example, it's super powerful. It can handle so much comparatively to just a decade and a half ago, to when people had to make all of their own stuff and spent a lot of hours in-house doing so. What you're noting could be done. It's more a case of, is the rate of return we're going to get on something like that, not we as the GHPC team, but just like developers in general, from balancing it, from making sure the simulation stays intact, is that going to work out in a timely fashion? Would developers be spending years on something like that?
I've got a minor objection. I mean, there's a lot of things we do workflow-wise that make things faster, and the engine can do a fair bit of heavy lifting.
Mhm.
But the thing about, like, the World War II Online stuff, I actually wish I got to play that game when it was in its heyday. But I think when it was popular enough in Oceania, they had it was still when it was, like, quite expensive, and I was a high schooler, so I couldn't afford it and all that kind of thing. But the thing about doing a giant map like that is there's probably a way we could technically do it, but we would probably have to make pretty serious sacrifices to the fidelity and how it actually looked, which
Oh yeah.
people tolerated in the World War II online days, but people are already like there are people who are dissatisfied with how our game looks now, and we're really struggling to get it to look like it's hard to make a game look right with dense forest and 4 kilometer rendering distance, right? It's it gets compared to first person shooters and stuff a lot of the time, but in reality, first person shooters can stop rendering most of their foliage after, I don't know, 500
Couple
meters, and
couple
then
hundred meters,
Mhm.
yeah,
and
and
they're
then after
down.
a
No more
K,
detail.
yeah, and then after up to a K, you just need like a bit more, the course details. And in reality, you don't have these like 12 times optics and stuff that you're trying to engage things at 2, 3, 4 kilometers all the time. It's really, really hard to the view frustum, as they call it, like the giant arc, the enormous pizza slice of terrain that you need to be able to render in full fidelity. Because if you've got a tank out in the field, and it's behind a tree or a bush or whatever, that bush needs to actually be there, as well as everything else in that giant area of land that we're trying to render all at once. So I think we could maybe do really big maps if we pushed it, but we'd have to drop the fidelity down, and people are already upset about like we can't dig holes in the ground with our howitzers or whatever crazy nonsense they want.
That's a
Yeah.
very fair point because when I look at these kinds of questions, I'm definitely looking at it from like a simulation of the data in the background sort of perspective. Harry, more often than not, reins me in and says like, "Well, hold up. This technically, from an artist perspective, would be wild to try and put together."
Yeah, this is kind of the curse of making a game in the realistic genre in the current day. And I know Harry has some experience with this. Back in, I don't know, you go back a decade and a half, you could get away with a lot. You could take a lot of shortcuts because the fidelity just wasn't what it is now. Like, I think, Harry, you got started modding Half-Life. And if
Yeah.
you're modding Half-Life, all the textures are low res and all the models are, there's only so many tries and people just accept it, right? If you're making something that has to look essentially AAA or close enough that people won't complain about it, it really ties your hands as far as what you can get away with. You have to spend all your effort on getting certain things to be right, and then there's no room left in the dev time or in the performance budget to do the rest.
Yeah, it's been really wild. In particular, I guess this probably isn't something that will come up on your server Enigma, but like as we build out um, features and stuff, as we increase the quality of the simulation and make it look better, basically the better we try and present the game to address this sort of like, let's up our, let's make it look more like a professional product. Let's make it more pleasing to look at. The tricky thing about that is the expectations go up alongside it, because the more it looks like a proper game, in quotation marks, the higher people's expectations get. And they're like, I think a lot of the time they'll sort of people will criticize it as if it's a thing made by a full staff of 30 or 40 people, full time for a year or whatever. Like there's a lot of games where we're sort of punching in the same league as that are. It's a lot more people, and it's not to say we're awesome at it or whatever. It's just we've used a lot of dirty tricks and cutting corners to make something that still holds up. It's all tricks, but those tricks work on people, and they start expecting more and more, and it gets harder as you go.
Oh yeah, you can see it in the way the feedback goes too. Like, one thing that I see from time to time when I do break my own rules and go look at the comments or whatever, um, people will say something like, "Oh, the physics are terrible. This game has horrible physics," and I'm sitting there thinking, "What are you talking about? The ballistics model, I put so much work into making sure that was good, and the armor penetration is like very passable for reality. Like, what are you talking about?" all the gear ratios are realistic on the tanks. And then you start to look at in detail, what are they talking about? They're talking about like the tank doesn't leave ruts in the ground, and you can't crash through a fence, like stuff that's not done yet, work in progress, whatever. They're talking about the aesthetic of realistic physics, the surface details. And this is like, it's exactly what we were just talking about. It's once you start presenting as this kind of high effort thing, achieving a certain level of visual detail, the omissions in that become more glaring, and people start expecting it and being upset when it's not there. And that was kind of mind-blowing to me, because until then we'd kind of relied on like people recognizing the core intent of what we were doing, and we want to get the performance of the tanks right and the experience of doing the combat. And then we have the complaints coming in about like, oh, the visuals. It's like, well, that wasn't even in my mind. Like, why is that important? But
Yeah,
that's just how a lot of people think.
Yeah.
It's surprising. Yeah, that surprises me, because I actually think the game looks really good, and I think it runs well too. So that's surprising. Sorry, Kavi, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say on the point of aesthetics and expectation, we even though I was just saying that engines have come a long way as a kind of middleware and not something that we have to like build out ourselves, we still have to fight the expectations of these very well-known engines putting forward tech demos on technology that is wholly unrealistic to ever put forward. And then that is something that gets brought up for us to try and say, are you guys going to implement X, Y, or Z new feature that might be a thing in 5 to 10 years?
Let's
Like,
put
Yeah.
the mud from spin tires in, man.
Yeah, the
Just
mud
pour
from
it
spin
in.
tires. That's a classic example. It's like, and I can't really blame them, because like if you're not a game developer, you don't understand what goes into
oh
certain
no, not at
things or
all.
whatever. But like the amount of effort and retooling it would require to do even like that kind of single feature from a different game, like that entire game was built around those mud physics. That was a core effort piece for them. Or something like what's another one? Like people watch the Unreal Engine 5 demos, and they see the what is it, Nanite, the rendering system for the LODs and everything. They say, well, why don't you guys switch to Unreal 5? You'll get to use this thing. And
like Nano would help us at all.
yeah, no, it's so far divorced from the problems that our game has to solve. But then like you can't sit there and respond to all those questions and explain like in great detail why it's a different kind of development issue and why it won't solve it and why it doesn't matter. Like it, so you just get bombarded with these opinions that are like, okay, well, this is not even remotely realistic, and I can't explain why because I don't have the time, you know.
I have a question for Enigma, actually. This sort of spurred me to thinking about the times that I've tried to get into DCS. And I mostly follow it through friends and YouTube and stuff these days. But when I've tried to play it, I've sort of thought there's this weird thing where they have the full fidelity cockpits and the mid fidelity ones, and there's some mod planes that have a bad flight model, and I think even some official modules that have a flight model that people are upset with. And you run into all this stuff about like, oh, don't fly the MiG-29 because it's not actually simulated. So effectively, there's no MiG-29 in the game. At least if you play it according to those kind of standards. What's your approach like with? I assume I don't think you're running like the F104 or any of that stuff on your server, right? Like, is that do you have a sort of bar where you sort of won't put something in because it won't mix because it's not modeled properly, or are you sort of more we just need whatever fills the role sort of approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, DCS is an old game, right? And any old game, at no fault of the game, has some baggage. So, and this goes back to what you were saying about the mixed level of fidelity. So, it is common in the DCS community where most people do not like the FC3 planes. The FC3 planes are the low fidelity, the non-clickable planes, which is ironic because I actually think that module pack is probably one of the best ones the game has ever made. And actually, it has something that none of the other modules really have, which is a commonality in the controls. And I was over the moon when I booted up GHPC and started playing around with the tanks, and I was like, oh great, like the controls have commonality between all of them. I don't need to learn a whole new tank. I mean, you do in terms of like how to use the sight and like the characteristics of the tanks, but like the controls have been figured out already, right, to make it common. And touching about flight models that have issues. The only thing that we've ever done, there was one plane that had an issue with the flight model, and it's a low strike fighter, but people were abusing it by flying it at like 13,000 meters. So one of the developers on our team is an aeronautical engineer, and what he did was he got the manual for the plane and figured out the max speed of the plane when it carried no payload, and if it was flying above that speed, it entered a chance bracket. So the faster it was going above that speed, a dice would be rolled. And the longer it stayed above that threshold and the further away it was above that threshold, more dice were rolled. And if it was unlucky, a firecracker was spawned and it would pop at the tailpipe and then the afterburner would get disabled. So that's how we fixed that one.
Is it the big one?
Yeah. But
yeah, this goes back to the cheesing thing that I was talking about earlier, by the way. Like, they find something to exploit, and you're like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, and the thing is,
have to deal with this.
Yeah, and we had to deal with it, right? And it's not the module maker's fault for that, like, being a thing, because that plane is made to fly a treetop level to do a pre-planned packet, a pre-planned strike mission. And to get low and fast, and people are flying at 13,000 meters. I'm sure no one tested that plane at that altitude. It's not made really to do that. But to their credit, when that issue started to become a thing, and because the server's so large, like we were able to get a lot of data and flag it to the developers, and they fixed it. Like they brought it back to it closer to its envelope. So credit to them. So does that answer your question, Harry?
Yeah, more or less. I thought it was quite interesting actually that you said that you liked the Flaming Cliffs package as one of the nicest like modules. I mean, again, I don't play, so I don't feel super qualified in the opinion, but I always thought it was a really nice set the way it's sort of everything's like the fidelity's not there compared to, your heat blur stuff or whatever, but it's consistent, right? They all feel like they're part of the same product, and yeah, it's interesting. There's some balance to strike where you were talking about like controls commonality and stuff like that. I think our approach to it is basically the players should be able to make their intent known easily. So if you want to go forwards, I want my tank to go forwards. You should have the same interface to making it go forwards, but all the quirks and the peculiarities of the hardware should still be there. So if it's got an interesting fire control system, you should still control it with like one tank might have a palm switch versus a thumb switch or something, right? We're not going to change that because it's the intent of behind the control is I want to move the turret. I'm going to energize the turret and start turning it. So that control should always be the same. But any of the peculiarities of the system and the dynamics between them should probably be, because that's the character, right, that we were talking about before. Like if you're not portraying that, you're throwing out most of what makes a sim interesting, and that's kind of what you miss if you play like War Thunder or Battlefield or whatever. All those like little interface quirks.
Yeah, you miss something by going too far either direction. If you simulate everything to the point where you need to memorize a bunch of controls to do basic tasks, you're overcomplicating the system. It's like I think there was some debate about this for some other game, like changing laser modes on a PEC 15 or something on a M4. Like, oh, we should have to hit a different button for this laser control versus that one. And it's like, well, in real life, you just move your hand, you have muscle memory, and you do the thing, like make it one switch. You don't have to simulate every button in depth to make it proper. But then you go the other direction, like the War Thunder problem, where every tank has a sniper scope with ballistic reticle markings, and they're all the same. And you have no indication of the capability difference or the character of those vehicles because it's just all kind of wiped out. So we try to hit that middle part where the important stuff is there, but we're not beholden to the minutia and the absolute hair-pulling madness of simulating each specific switch and finicky little thing. Like, I don't know, some of the feedback I read about like DCS planes or whatever, like as an observer, not a player, kind of like Harry. I can't imagine doing that for tanks. Like getting people saying, actually, this switch is over here, and if you have it in this mode, it does this. Like, fuck that. I'm not going to program that. That's too much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I might put my foot in my mouth, but I think I do actually believe this, which is, let me think of how I want to say this. Running through a checklist to make something super realistic, if you have the documentation, is hard, right? Because it's taxing on time of following the checklist and going through it, right? But I would argue maybe that taking a lot of different systems and vehicles and looking at it in a more abstract way and finding the commonalities while retaining the soul of the systems, I would argue is a harder thing. And I would guess that a lot of sim players, especially DCS ones, would say that's an outrageous thing to say. But to me, it's almost like, think about, how do I want to say? I would say to support my argument, I would say is when you think about the Romantic period and realism, the camera came, right? And before, like Renaissance artists and the Romantic period, people were trying to make very realistic looking paintings, right? And then photography came, and it kind of, I don't want to say wiped them out, but artists kind of shifted up and they went into abstract art, right? And it was something that photography couldn't do. And the documentation do exist, and developers can and modelers can go and do all that. But like I said, I think it's harder to be more abstract about it and find the commonalities while retaining the soul.
I think that's
yeah. Go ahead.
Joel, sorry. I think that's like pretty much on the money. But I think it comes back to before I mentioned that people basically don't have a game design vocabulary and aren't in the habit of thinking about things as a game design problem, especially in the sim community, like sim, not, your War Thunder players might be different or whatever, but the guys who just play sims and make sim pits and all that kind of thing, in their head, the way to make it realistic is just make it how it technically is, just the materiality of the object, just replicate it as close as you can. And the logic is, if you do that, you're going to get the right behaviors. You're going to provoke the player to use it in the correct way because the situation has been simulated, and you'll be immersed in that and all that kind of thing. But it kind of it's a little bit short-sighted in a way, because none of the incentive structures that are there in the real world, like the big obvious one, the elephant in the room, is if you lose in real life, you actually die or get captured and tortured or whatever, right? None of that can be simulated. So you already have to you have to bridge that gap somehow, and a lot of that is like you need to create different incentive structures to make the player do the thing properly. And the other one is, I guess, in the case of DCS, the argument for making the controls a little bit more, like, have a bit more commonality is you'll generally come up against people flying more competently, maybe. You can assume that if someone can get a jet in the air and engage an enemy, they're a little bit more on the ball and a little bit more familiar with their aircraft than someone who's just installed the module and is still doing all their key binds that take several flights and probably half an hour worth of just looking at the menu or whatever. I think if you erase all of that, you get maybe to the juice a bit faster. You get people up and running, and once that if you enrich the environment with people who know what they're doing, then you're probably going to get a little bit, like, paradoxically, you'll get a little bit closer to an environment that makes sense for the aircraft or whatever.
Yeah, and to chain off of that, it's choosing your battles from the developer's side too, right? If you want to create an authentic battlefield, the less time you spend tasking your artists and your programmers to make switch panels for the interior and to make sure that behavior is correct, the more time you can spend filling out the roster of vehicles and making sure that you can depict a situation properly, that you have all the different roles filled and you can construct that scenario.
I'm glad you mentioned interiors, because that's a thing that comes up. That's, as an example, that comes up regularly as well, I would like this because it's going to give me more aesthetic, more potential control, if combined with like the dream of a person's request with VR or something. When in reality, none of that is, I guess, realistic to the core principles that we're going to go for.
Yeah, it's not going to enhance the experience that we designed. It's kind of back to that, like, what people expect based on their past game experience or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, the sim players cannot fathom how we would even dream of making a realistic tank game with no interiors. It's one of the most common complaints, like Hoppy said. And if you push back on it, some of them say, okay, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, whatever. Like, I can see how it's not strictly necessary. You're going to spend a lot of your time in the gun sites, blah, blah, blah. But some of them get really upset because it's like the concept of having a simulation game to them is intertwined with the immersion of, like, I'm in the tank. This is my seat in the tank. I have the buttons in front of me. Like, kind of like full cockpit switch flights and stuff. And that is a thing that you could go for. That is cool in its own way. If you master that, you know that you can, like, okay, now I conceptually understand what a pilot does in the startup or whatever. But that only goes so far. That doesn't give you the experience of what the plane's actually doing. That's a separate piece. And we've chosen to focus our resources on that piece instead. So it's, we have full faith that the experience is not going to suffer for the fact that you can't look out of your sight and look over at your loader while you're playing. We think that's not going to matter. We think people will come around to that if we do it right.
I mean, it doesn't matter.
People kind of
look at
already are coming around to it. I think
Yeah.
the only places it does matter is maybe stuff with Windows. That kind of matters. But yeah, like I'm sure some of your audience will be sort of thinking, oh, how they're going to do it, like the same thing, like how they're going to do a sim without fully modeled interiors or whatever, right? But like it's very, very different to an aircraft. Like you're sitting in an aircraft and the interface to the outside world is the bubble that's over your head, right? That's how you see everything. That's your window to the world. But in a tank, your window to the world is like a tiny little slot or an eyepiece of a gunner's optic. If you want to see more than that, you stick your head out a hole and you're not looking at the inside of the tank almost ever. So it's very, very hard to justify. I mean, I think maybe the best way to approach this, to field the question of the interiors for us, is like, we'd love to do it. Like, it'd be cool if we had all interiors, and everyone would agree, right? If we have everything fully modeled, it'd be awesome. But it's probably more time to model the interior of a vehicle than even to model the exterior. So you can at least double the expected wait time on new stuff going in the game. And also considering that, like, we have very few staff, it's going to be cutting into the time of producing everything else as well. So like buildings, inventory, all that kind of thing. We're dedicating all that to get interiors, and then you're going to be spending most of your time looking through a tiny hole or sticking your head out the top because you can't see when you're inside the vehicle. Like it's a very very different problem to a flight
We're
sim.
leaving tens of dollars on the table here, guys.
I didn't even touch on the manpower part because I wanted to justify it from a design perspective, and like it's not that needed. But yeah, the unspoken part was it's a massive undertaking to do interiors. We could do it if we thought it was important and we wanted to divert to that, but you'd be looking at instead of like adding the Russians and the Germans to the game this year and fleshing out this theater and getting to 1.0, we'd be postponing everything to put the switches in the T-72, so that when you get your turret blown off, the last thing you see is a very intricately modeled control handle instead of the exterior view. That's not going to make that much difference.
Seems like a reasonable position to me. I mean, what I like to say is the juice worth the squeeze, right? And and that kind of sums it up. I have we've been talking for an hour and a half. I have one last question, and this is about persistence. And in that Dark Age video, what I was really pointing out about sim games is that a lot of them lack dynamic campaigns. And I know you guys have a campaign in your game. But I would like to bring this to multiplayer, and I understand what you guys said earlier about the single player experience coming to co-op. But I would be kind of curious if you guys have thought about persistence on top of that, even for PvP, which might come down later down the road. But any thoughts about like persistent online campaigns, even if they're not fully blown PvP, but having maybe like in DCS we call it like Op4, where actually, here's a good example. You guys ever played Left 4 Dead? Yeah. So remember how like I think it's like 4 players are on the human side, and I think they have like 2 on the zombie side, and they kind of just spawn in, and they're kind of there just to keep the players honest, if you will. I would just be kind of curious about that idea, as well as like the idea of having persistent online campaigns or persistent scenarios. I just would really love to get your guys' reaction to that.
Yeah, so we've thought about a lot of these things. I mean, kind of a big part of what we do is we look at what we've made and where we're going, and we say, what would make this better? What if we do this? What if we do that? So these things have come up. The PvP as like special enemies kind of thing, like Left 4 Dead, that's definitely come up. I think if we do PvP, it's most likely to take that form, where you're still doing a very structured scenario, but it's just, okay, allow human players on the other team. It's very deliberate, very focused goals. And as far as the persistence, it's an interesting dilemma, because if we're doing this kind of single player to co-op connection, like the game is essentially the same, you play with your friends, you're going to get persistence in a way. The campaign, when it's more fully fleshed out, is going to have consequence that stretches between missions, and you'll be able to see the shape of the war changing based on your actions. Right now, it's just like it rules random missions. That's work in progress. But we have this idea of persistence baked into our plans that will carry over to multiplayer. But I think what you're asking about is more of a like the server exists whether you're logged in or not, and you have a persistent war that gets pushed forward by all the players collectively, similar to your experience. If that's
yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking. I realize you got the maps are smaller, so they would be on a smaller scale. So maybe persistent war is I feel like that means a lot, but like a persistent engagement, I guess. On
sure. So it's not going to happen on one map either way. Like one map is like one skirmish. But if we were to do something like that, it would probably be less ambitious, and stuff like that is, I mean, it really depends how the initial multiplayer stuff goes, what we think is lacking, and where we want to take it. Because any extra features will take time to implement. We'll see what happens with our initial co-op phase, what gets the most fun factor, what's most in line with our design goals, and then who knows?
I think we've talked a little bit on and off. Like, there's no solid plans for PvP, obviously, because any plan you can make, you're going to play it with people, and they're going to screw it up, and you need to change it anyway. But I think we've talked about maybe trying, if you've ever played Insurgency, the armor mission, how you could just jump into, like, one team could sort of possess an enemy unit. I think doing something like that could be cool, like as a PvP thing. Like, you're playing your campaign, and then you might have a setting or whatever that says just open up the enemy team for someone to jump on and just do the keep you honest sort of thing. As far as persistent stuff. I think if we were going to do that, just because it doesn't really make sense to have an endless battle over like a 8 by 8 kilometer map. But I think if we were going to go down that route, it'd be something more like I think there's some IL2 campaigns that do this sort of like, it's like a web-based almost, where you can sort of see which teams are ahead. Like you sign up for a campaign that lasts a few weeks or whatever, and you all go and run your missions to try and like it'll spin up scenarios and say, okay, this team's pushing here, and then people can log in and go and join that push, and they'll shift the meta, and it's like a broader, more zoomed out campaign or something. I think that'd be like a step after we finished more smaller scale stuff, because again, we want to make sure that if people are playing this game, they can organize a game easily, firstly by making it fun in single player to start with, and secondly like targeting those sort of smaller player groups where you can sort of say to your friends, oh, do you want to load up our GHPC campaign and do some missions or whatever. It's just, you don't need to rent a server just to play it at all.
Yeah, making sure the barrier to entry is low is a huge part of our design considerations. Like making an example is making the textures and models kind of slightly lower fidelity, like optimized instead of super high poly, whatever, like insane detail, because it doesn't really affect the way the game plays, and it allows us to iterate faster. But more importantly, it keeps the file size of the game small, so the barrier to installing and playing GHPC is pretty low. Like, what is it, 10 gigs right now? Something like that. We're not going into the territory of, oh, what do I have to delete to install this game? Like, people can just get it and play it, and there's no worrying about that. So same thing for the multiplayer, right? We want it to be very chill, very easy access. Hey, you guys want to join me for this mission? Join your friends through Steam, whatever, jump in. There's no big deal about it. There's no server browsing kind of thing. We could always put that in if we wanted to, but like the thing that I personally would want to make sure is in first and foremost is that jump in co-op, that easy experience, get your friends together, have a good time.
Have you played MechWarrior 5, Enigma?
I have not played MechWarrior 5. I played
It's specifically that one. They've got the like it's effectively what we're going for, like realistically. It's just basically a mission generator was what their campaign is, with the interstitial in between of like, this got damaged, that got damaged. I've got these mechs, whatever, in their game. Load in and go fight, whatever the scenario is. That's pretty much what in the end our campaign is going to turn out to be. Like,
yeah, no,
realistically, like we could shoot for the moon, but scenarios are going to be anywhere from like, I don't know, 10 minutes surprise, you've been destroyed by the ambush you should have seen coming, whatever scenario, up to like an hour, maybe 2 if we can do that. But it's not going to persist on the same scenario.
It's interesting because what Harry said, and think about what you said, kind of, it's an interesting idea because with these really focused and curated conflicts, doing like kind of what IL2 did to try to string them together and have them. It's actually interesting that War Thunder never did that, because I've actually always thought about that is like, if you because War Thunder has like these Counter-Strike lobbies, and it seems like they amount to nothing besides your personal grind. And I've always wondered, like, why don't they have like a global map and they would just take the averages of like all the players doing these individual battles, and you would see the front lines move or something. I just like that always surprised me. So it is interesting talking to you guys, because as a player and an observer, it's like you have these ideas, and then talking with you guys, it's like first off, it's nice to hear that you guys are really trying to be custodians of your guys' idea, right? I would imagine it's really easy and or tempting to try to jump toward a publisher that wants to do something different and like morph or kill the idea. and the very realistic limitations of being a small team, and each of you are limited by having 24 hours in a day. So trying to weigh and judge, is the juice worth the squeeze? It kind of all comes to this, right? So it's interesting.
Yep, it's as a small team, we're pretty much running at capacity all the time. There's not more squeeze left to get more juice, to use that analogy. We're doing everything that we can. We're doing it as fast as we can, within reasonable limits. We don't crunch. We just keep up a good pace. So, yeah, we have to very carefully weigh everything that we design into the game, knowing that we're going to be the ones to make it happen. We can't just plan for it and then have it magically come into being, and then the thing you said about publishers, not to get too far into it, but publishers were more tempting in the early phase when we hadn't launched yet, when we were a kind of a fledgling project on Patreon trying to get people's attention. That was the point where we were like, okay, we need to have enough money that we can all work on this as our main thing. We have a lot of part-time, a lot of juggling of hours. Once we launched, that problem sort of solved itself. Not that we're like rolling in dough or anything, but we have enough to make it work. And that took a lot of that guesswork out of it. Are we going to be able to actually do this? And now we don't have to compromise. So if we have a discussion with a publisher, it's no longer framed as like, what are we willing to give up to make our goals happen? Now it's like, what can they offer that we can't already do? It's a very different conversation, and it's a very nice place to be in. We're very fortunate.
It's awesome. It's awesome because it's possible, right? Like the whole Patreon thing to seed something, and then Steam being like a ubiquitous point of sale that everyone has access to. It's great to see.
That's actually kind of one of the things I was hoping to get out of this discussion. Like, the people who have these kind of like, they want these kind of games. We want it to be. We want to sort of maybe lead the way a little bit. Not to suggest that we're doing an enormous amount of lifting, but we want to kind of get that message out there that like, if you do want these things to happen, like there is a market for it. There are people who, and that's kind of like your video, right? Like there's people who want to see this stuff come back, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in your community that have some programming skills or whatever, and maybe they just don't have that little bit extra. But like that's how Josh started as well, right? He's just making like tinkering on some project, and now it's like kind of becoming a full thing. Like it's possible. Like people should join in and get involved, you know.
Yeah, there's nothing particularly special about us. We're not like, God's gift to sim gaming or whatever, but we think there are probably people like us out there in different aspects of sim gaming. Maybe there's somebody on the cusp of inventing, GHPC for planes or whatever. And if we can identify each other in the indie game dev community in this kind of problem space and help each other out, we could maybe make that resurgence happen, end the dark age. That would be a very cool thing to come out of this as a side effect, and it's something that we're looking out for.
I'm into it. I like it. I think it's a really cool thing. Maybe the good way to put it is, what's that old saying? If you build it, they come.
Yes.
So it's inspiring. It's interesting. Anything I would like to kind of pass the mic around for. I don't want to say closing thoughts, because maybe someone has a good thought, we can talk about it more. But any thoughts? I'm gonna go in reverse order. So Lancer, anything that you want to talk about or put out there into the ether?
I don't know. I'm just the topic of using systems and the context they were designed for. Like I said, it'd be like scenario based in our game, but it's a fucking good example. in BMS, or no, not BMS, DCS. Everybody like fucking rockets off runway, like uses up all their fuel in their tanks, and then like immediately jettisons their tanks because they don't give a shit. They have unlimited amount of like fuel tanks. Whereas like if you play fucking BMS, if you keep dumping your fuel tanks, you will have no more fuel tanks. You will now have to use internal fuel, and you're fucked for the rest of the campaign until resupply hits. They can't do long range missions, can't do this or that. You're now restricted because you just dumped this one thing, and if you play like DCS, it's inconsequential. Like why have this anymore? Like I don't need to keep this. Like just using the systems in the context that they were designed for.
Consequences have actions. I like it. Right? Trying to be thoughtful, and things have a purpose. So I'm into that. Kavi?
I think the work that we're doing on GHPC is wild because it's been just grown from the ground up for one person's idea of really wanting to write a love letter to older tank games and seeing how much of a community that has brought together. So really looking forward to the work that we're going to complete this year.
I think I've blabbed on about almost everything I want to talk about. I'm a big fan of like what you're doing for DCS. Again, even though I don't play, I'm sort of like, hearing about how your server works and some of the ideas behind it, or at least what I can divine are the ideas behind it. I think it's pretty much exactly what the community needs to sort of prove that. I think we're doing similar work in a lot of ways, like sort of bridging that gap in what, like when people sort of lose their imagination on how something might be able to actually work and how it might actually pull together and make sense. I think I'm a big fan of what you're doing there. It's cool.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Action Scripper, any closing thoughts? And don't forget to mention what's the best way to support GHPC also as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. So right off the bat then, best way to support GHPC is honestly just to buy the game and try it. And if you like the game, tell your friends about it who are into sim gaming, because we think we've got something neat, something different, and the more people find out about it, the better we can grow the project. We're in an interesting position as a small team, constantly making the best out of the resources that we have. It's gotten a little easier over time, but it's never a sure thing, and it's never a foregone conclusion that we'll be able to do everything that we set out to. We've been very good at limiting our scope so far, which I think has worked in our favor, saying yes to some things and no to others, and really keeping our resources focused. I think that's what's allowing us to pull through. But yeah, as far as stuff I want to talk about, I've covered pretty much everything I had in mind, unless we were to get into other just random stuff about game design. But yeah, it's been really cool to figure some of this out. Like, there's a lot of stuff in game dev that you wouldn't anticipate until it happens, and I've learned so many things about just the experience of making a game and interacting with a community and all this stuff. I honestly can't wait to keep doing it. It's been a wild ride, and I love it.
All right. Well, just want to thank you for your guys' time and candor. A very candid conversation, which was interesting, and it was. I'm definitely not on the same scale as you guys. I just have a server, so it was interesting for me to hear your guys' perspective about player reactions and having a philosophy and kind of seeing how people react to it and sticking to your guns, if you will. So I wish you guys really good luck in this year with your guys' project. I'm following it very closely, and I know a lot of other people that are following it super closely as well. So I wish you guys good luck. I'm really looking forward to multiplayer. I'm curious to see what you guys do with co-op and if PvP comes. So I just wish you good luck, and I hope people here who have development skills and are tempted to maybe build something of their own, that they they take this as a moment of pause to kind of think about maybe, is the juice worth the squeeze, and if they want to help join the crusade, if you will, on getting us out of this dark age, if you will.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here and share some thoughts and kind of connect on this. It's a conversation worth having, and thanks for reaching out to us for it.